Hello, I currently go to college in Maryland, and I've lived here most of my life. My story takes place 6 months ago. At the time, I was still a high school senior, living the life I wanted to live, working with theater, having a nice girlfriend, etc. An important point to note in my story is that, at the time, I was in an AP art class with a concentration set of pieces revolving around a certain category of fear. Having already submitted a few potential college credits, my teacher gave us banners to work on so she could hang them up in her room for next year's classes to see. I was having a certain amount of artist block, but I had a lot of time, so I watched a good deal of YouTube in the meantime. I was looking at something related to Call of Duty when I noticed a video regarding something called the Goat Man. Being thoroughly enticed, I clicked on the video and listened. It had my attention enough that I decided it would be the subject of my artwork. As I researched further, I also noted that it was close to home, just on the other side of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, close to Bowie, Maryland. Again, being a high school student close to graduation, I thought it would be a fine idea to have a small trip to look it over. I enlisted 2 of my friends, who I'll call Brennan and Carmen for the purposes of my story. I had brought up the idea to other people who thought it would be a waste of time, including my girlfriend. I wasn't a skeptic of the existence of cryptid animals, and while Brennan was, Carmen was in the same boat as me. So we set off to Prince George's County on a Friday night, so we didn't have to worry about waking up or having any impending finals waiting for us. With us, we brought a couple of cameras, our phones, snacks, and anything we needed for a scouting trip in the woods. As Carmen drove, I continued my research, taking note of creatures such as wendigos and skinwalkers. But I was very excited about the possible promise of the Goat Man. After about an hour of driving, we reached our destination at about 9-ish at night. It just turned dark, and it was quite warm out, expected of early summer. Carmen informs me and Brennan that it was time to go out and begin our search. She parked the car alongside a stretch of road with forest on either side, with very little traffic. We turned on the flashlights we brought so that we could save the phone battery. Not that it would have mattered since we had no service, even though I thought I had 4 bars when we went through town. Just the forest. I figured we trudged through the woods, listening to the sounds of nature. Brennan and Carmen were talking ahead of me. Apparently some long-term couples had just broken up. Lots of juicy details. As we continued our discussion, I noticed that there was I'm not really sure how to describe it because of how little I felt it, but there was just a nagging feeling on my shoulder. I swept it off, though. It's been a while since I've been through the woods. Maybe I was just paranoid. We were just having a good time, joking around and having a lot of jollies when we suddenly heard a snap. Something I always knew was that in this area, the only thing that could snap a branch would be a human. We were stopped in our tracks and looked in the direction of the noise. Just deep blackness. Brennan called out, "Anyone there?" With no response. We eased up a little. It was at this moment I regretted not bringing a machete I left at home. Despite that, the sounds of the forest were still present, and we kept moving, more alert now. It's about our 4th hour of hiking, so it's about 1 a.m. Having found nothing of interest, Brennan looks slightly peeved, while I have my arm around Carmen because she claimed being cold, which it was surprisingly chilly, being in the middle of summer. Are we ever going to find? Brennan is cut off by the snap of another tree branch. We stop dead in our tracks. This time, I notice the sounds of the forest are gone. The nagging feeling I felt earlier is emphasized greatly, almost like it's telling my body to get out. Carmen looks up with wide eyes and says, "What was that?" Clearly panicked, I shake my head. A chill runs down my spine. I don't know. When we begin to hear footsteps again, they sound much heavier than a human. We look at each other, looking for an answer, and only freak each other out more when we can't give one. We walk back the way we came, slowly. When my foot lands on something with a small squash, I look down and see a squirrel's body, or what's left of it anyway, with a large bite taken out of its stomach and only small bits of entrail left. I quiver, that feeling reaching a peak as if it's going to explode when the bar fills. Brennan gasps, I see that he's looking at a certain area, and I turn slowly to check. Carmen hides her face behind her hoodie-sleeved arm, only showing her eyes. We focus on the spot that Brennan is looking at. Standing there is a dark shape, maybe 40 yards away. I can't get a good grasp of what I'm looking at. It's huge but humanoid, but its legs are all wrong. They're more bent, like a horse's, or perhaps a goat's. Carmen stifles a scream as the figure just complacently stares at us. As my eyes adjust, I notice the shape of its head. Its facial features are blacked out, with our flashlights only reaching so far. But I can make out the horns on top of its head. Brennan is the first one to take action, yelling, "Run!" As he yells and grabs me and Carmen, I stumble, but I get good footing quickly as I sprint as hard as I can back in the direction of the car. After 10 minutes of steady sprinting, we slow as we seriously need to catch our breath. "What was that?" Carmen asks, huffing. Neither Brennan nor I answer, but I think we can agree on what we saw. We didn't want to admit it, but we also didn't want to feel like we were giving him power by evoking his name. We slowly go back to the car, which we would make it to in about an hour and a half. The entire time, the forest sounds were absent, almost making our footsteps echo. Carmen is mumbling to herself, while Brennan and I try to make small talk to ebb away at the deafening silence of the forest. Then we hear it, something between a wail, a scream, and some sort of animal. It couldn't be. We sprint again, making our way back to the car. Something was here. There were claw-like marks on the sides of the car, peeling the steel like a knife through butter. We decided it would be much better if we investigated once we got home. The car ride home was silent. We put on some Hamilton on the radio as it's a musical we all like to sing to, but no one felt like singing. Brennan looked out the window, still pale, while Carmen looked more depressed, if anything. "My parents will kill me because of the car," she said finally. I couldn't say anything. My mind was still in a daze. What was that thing? We have told all of our friends the story, but as to be expected, nobody believed us. I still have so many questions, and one day I hope that I find out for sure what I saw was the Goat Man. Tonight, my sister, brother-in-law, 2 friends, and I all pile into a truck, and we headed out to the desert near the old Cal Portland concrete factory. About half an hour into driving, kicking up dust and messing around, everyone gets the chills, and my anxiety starts to flare up. We brush it off as the temperature difference and just keep going. 10 minutes later, we come around a corner, and my sister says, "Please tell me you guys just saw that woman." We responded with, "What woman?" She says, "We just passed a woman standing on the side of the road wearing pink. I think it was a pink shirt and she had blonde hair that was covering her face. She looked dead." I honestly thought she was messing with me, so we turn around and go to the spot where she saw her. No woman. Brother-in-law and I get our flashlights out and look around. No woman. I tell my sister she's seeing things, and she insists that she saw a woman. So I decide to check my dashcam footage. Sure as shit, there was a woman. She was crossing the road, it looks like, and she just vanishes into thin air. My camera isn't of the best quality by any means, and it was quite dark, but it's clear what we saw. My brother-in-law and I canvassed a 2-mile square radius with flashlights, calling out to the woman because we legitimately thought that someone was lost out in the desert. The entire time, we kept feeling and hearing things around us. Some info to note. This was right next to an extremely murky pond. There is a possibility that her body could be hidden in the pond. I was at a summer camp for 8 days, but I only spent 6 days at the camp as it was a day's drive up and back. The first few days were normal enough, but it was the night of the 3rd day when I couldn't sleep on account of the awful tents, which hardly closed and seemed to be infested with insects and arachnids of every kind. So I was awake for most of the night, listening to the sounds of the Tennessee woods, until I noticed some peculiar noises which didn't seem normal. I first noticed strange noises at around 1 a.m., 1 hour after lights out. First, it sounded like footsteps, but as time went on, I started to hear what sounded like whispering. I couldn't make out what it was saying at first because it was barely audible. I was pretty shaken up, but eventually the noises quieted down and I fell asleep. The next morning, I told Steve about it, and we both shrugged it off, although at this point, I wasn't sure I had been dreaming. I forgot about it into that next night, shortly before lights out, when I remembered and told Brian, X, and Pete, even though I was dreading it, of course. I would have to go to sleep eventually. When I went into my tent, I unsurprisingly could not sleep because of the noises. I couldn't sleep because I had what seemed like 6 billion bugs in my tent. At about 12:30 to 1 a.m., the noises started up again, this time louder and more intense. The noises started with footsteps again, but the footsteps quickly evolved into voices, not whispers, but full volume talking, and possibly even yelling at one point. Then the sounds morphed into chirping and squeaking. At one point, I even heard what sounded like a medieval battle horn, like the Narnia movies. Eventually, I grew tired of cowering in my tent and decided to check out the noises. I walked down to the bathrooms, which were about 200 feet away and down a hill from my tent. When I got to the bathroom, I realized that the squeaking noises seemed to be coming from a leaky old hose, which was a huge relief. I relieved myself and went back to my tent. I laid down, and it appeared the noises had stopped, but of course that was only temporary. When the noises started up again, I called out in a slightly hushed tone, thinking it was somebody playing a prank. It was about 2:30 to 3 a.m. at this point, and my friend Pete responded to my call and came over to my tent. Pete said that he had been up for a while because of the bugs in his tent when he noticed the noises too. He said that he had been up for about 30 minutes when he heard me and came over to my tent. Pete and I hung out in Steve and my tent for a while. Steve slept through the entire night, even with Pete and me trying to wake him up. While we were in the tent, the noises would stop and start repeatedly, alternating every 10 minutes. While Pete and I were in my tent with Steve sleeping next to us, in the tent, we noticed that the footsteps were getting increasingly closer and louder. The footsteps were so much that it sounded like they were right outside the tent. We figured it was another kid in a nearby tent named Edwin, sleeping. He did have a sleepwalking problem. We called out to Edwin, asking if he was all right, and there was no answer. We shrugged it off and continued talking. Actually, Pete got tired and returned to his tent at about 4 a.m. At this point, I decided I would try to get some rest too. I had been lying down for somewhere around 10 minutes when the noises started up once again, and I realized I would not be getting any sleep that night. I decided to walk around the camp and try to find the source of these noises. I did not find anything. However, I did walk by Brian and X's tent. I decided to see if they were awake by whispering into their tent. Brian was awake, but X was not. I asked Brian if he heard the noises, and he said he did. Brian had said he was listening to the noises for about an hour and a half when I came over. I told Brian to keep his ears open for any more weird noises, and went back to my tent. About 20 minutes later, I heard the noises start up again. I decided to wait for a few minutes to see if the noises would stop. The noises did not stop. I decided to go check around the campsite one more time. This time, though, I went to Brian and X's tent first to recruit them to help me check. When I got over there to the tent, both Brian and X were awake. It was almost 6 a.m. now, so X and Brian came out of their tent and walked around with me. We had checked the entire campsite and were about to return to our tents when we happened to be walking by the edge of a huge rectangular clearing behind our campsite. That's when we saw a strange animal at the other end of it. It was probably no more than 200 feet away. The thing looked like it was prone, completely still, just watching us. We didn't know what it was, so we started walking toward it. When it realized we were coming toward it, it got up. And this is when we realized that what we were looking at was no ordinary animal. The thing was about 3'6" and humanoid with a hunched-over posture and huge glowing orange eyes the size of tennis balls. It appeared to be pushed into its torso, having an appearance like that of some depictions of the Mothman. When it got up, it started hobbling away towards a large ditch. That's when I noticed some very interesting-looking wings, As we got closer, it became more frantic and started to move faster. But by the time we got there, it was gone, and the ditch was empty. We checked the area, and there was nothing. We found nothing of importance, though in somewhat of a hilarious turn, we did find an empty bag of Planters peanuts about 10 feet away from where the creature had been. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, my mother, father, grandmother, and I went to this restaurant out in a semi-remote location, which has since been turned into a factory area, but at the time, it was a log cabin-type restaurant backed off the road in the woods. My father is a really big talker, and he'll pretty much have a conversation with anyone if they got him talking. He was closing up a conversation with this guy who we went to high school with and hadn't seen in a long time. My mother, grandmother, and I went outside to head onto the vehicle. I was getting tired because it was late, so my grandma picked me up. She was holding me in a bear hug. Then I saw something. A very tall figure illuminated, probably 7 to 8 feet tall, completely covered in blonde hair, sort of like Cousin It from the Addams Family movie, but with more noticeable features. I just said to my granny, "It's a monster." She turned around and saw it too, and we began running towards the car. About this time, my mom noticed it as well. They didn't come towards us, it just turned and stared. We were freaking out, and then my dad came out of the building. He started running too because we were terrified, but didn't get a chance to see it because once he came around, it took off into the woods or at least out of eyesight. I know Bigfoot seems like a hard pill to swallow, but I saw something that night. I know I was a child, but we all saw it, and my mom and I talked about it for the first time in years today because we drove by the place the restaurant used to be at, and she described it exactly how I remembered it. I work on a horse farm, and tonight while I was feeding my horse, I noticed that they were all spooking at something on the other side of the farm. My boyfriend kept saying that there was a person on the other side. I thought he saw a tree that looked like a person until he pointed out where it was, and it looked unnecessarily tall. It was similar to a person, but not quite. And then, as we were looking at it, it started to move. I still thought it was a tree until we got to that side, and the donkeys that were over there because of coyotes were acting scared. Now, they are generally not scared. They're actually incredibly brave, which caught me off guard. Suddenly I heard something in the woods, and we pointed the headlight over at that same time. My boyfriend grabbed his shotgun because we both thought that there was a person trespassing. We noticed then it sounded like it was running away from us, so I was not too concerned anymore until we saw one on the property the exact next day. It was not a person, and there is no way it was a person. That is not what scared the both of us, though. The part that freaked us out was when I closed the gate and locked it up. Whatever this was, it was out there and started running at me. I immediately ran to the car and got in. When we finally got to the main road, this thing stopped chasing us. When we looked back, it was easily 8 feet tall and just standing in the middle of the road. I don't know what I saw, but I do know it was not a person. I do not know if it was a crawler or a skinwalker or anything like that, but I would like to know if they will come and cause issues at the farm. My boyfriend got to the main gate this time to see if it would chase him, or if it was just going to chase me. It also chased him and chased their car down the road for a little bit. I should probably mention that he was cussing at it and probably made it very mad. I have listened to some other stories on this show, and I'm pretty sure that what we are dealing with is a crawler. I'm going to try and figure out how to link some sort of video to the screaming that we caught on camera the other night. A group of friends and I were staying at this remote cabin that one of my friend's cousins owned. There were no real roads leading to the cabin, and it was a good 3/4-day hike from where you park the cars. I couldn't go at the same time as everyone else due to work obligations, so I decided to head up that same day, but later. It would mean I would have to camp for a night by myself, though, as the latter part of the trail is too dangerous to be taken at night, especially by someone who doesn't know it. I didn't care. I was kind of looking forward to it as I've never camped alone before. So I was in the middle of these woods when the sun went down. I got my camp set up in this small clearing, probably about 40 feet across. I got my campfire going and pitched myself a small one-person tent. I did all that camping stuff like cooking hot dogs over a stick over the fire and s'mores. I probably stayed up a good 2 to 3 hours after dark. It was mid-autumn, so the days were somewhat short. The entire time, I thought I heard stuff moving in the woods at the edge of the clearing. I didn't think anything of it at the time because the woods are, of course, full of animals. But as the night went on, I realized that whatever it was just circling the clearing over and over. Once I started paying attention, it made 4 or 5 laps around before I decided to get up and investigate. The noise stopped as soon as I stood up, and I thought I heard the sound going away through the woods. I just shrugged it off, thinking it was a fox or some curious critter that got scared when I stood up. I decided it was time to sleep, doused the fire, and climbed into my tent. I started to doze off and stayed in that half-asleep, half-awake state for a while. I normally hear weird stuff when I'm in this state, so I didn't think much of it when I heard a voice. Something then woke me up all the way, and I realized the voice was real. It was right outside my tent. It was just above a whisper, and I'm not sure if it was another language or if they were just speaking English in such a way that I couldn't understand it. I lay there for some time. I don't know how long, listening and waiting for something to happen. There was just enough moonlight to light up the walls of the tent so I could see. A hand pressed into the wall of my tent down near my foot. This freaked me out, and I sat up quickly. Whoever was outside the tent tore off from there like running full sprint through the woods. I got out of the tent and shined my flashlight around to see nothing. I was expecting there to be a bloody handprint on the tent, but nope. I didn't sleep that night. I packed up camp at first light and booked it to the cabin. I'm a 34-year-old outdoorsman, and I have been for the last 15 years or so. My love for nature and adventure has me spending a lot of my free time solo hiking all over California with my dog Nina. I am a firm believer in the supernatural, solely due to my own personal experiences with the unknown. After so many experiences, my curiosity led me to find something I couldn't explain. Last year, I was solo hiking with my dog about 6 miles away from the nearest road, right after a full day and night of snow. I reached a peak and discovered an amazing valley. It resembled an ancient lake with trees in different stages of development littered as far as I could see. It was unusually flat and diverse in plant life for that part of the Tahoe National Forest. Shortly after reaching the peak, I came across a fresh set of tracks. I know tracks very well in California, and these were not made by any documented animal. They were about 16 inches long and 6 inches wide, and sunk into the ground about 5 times deeper than my own tracks. It had pads like dogs in the front, but there were no claw marks like you might see from a bear. The tracks seemed to transition as they went on, and this animal thing was dragging something with it. There was no blood, but there were clear signs as something was being dragged momentarily. Alongside the bizarre, unknown tracks were a fresh set of mountain lion tracks, as well as another week-old cougar track, likely from the same cat. Also, in one of the videos, my dog's tracks are alongside them as well, making for a very good reference. My dog is 65 pounds, and her paw prints next to those were like Simba's next to Mufasa's. I recorded the tracks in about 3 different short videos for later examination. Until this day, I have no explanations, and my curiosity grew. That was 1 year ago. Since then, I have gone to other places and seen them and other cool, bizarre things. However, I still never forgot about those tracks. I was always planning on going back to explore that area when I could find a better access point. I eventually got a kick-ass 4-wheel drive SUV and found the perfect route that leads within a mile or so of the valley. 3 days ago, in December 2021, I finally went back, and this is what happened. I arrived at the end of a rough 1-lane dirt road sometime around noon. There is no cell reception in this area, and there were no other people. It's not the easiest place to get to, and it's not the kind of place that will attract your average camper or hiker, since there are no marked trails, and it dead ends after about 2 miles. I was entering from the west side of the bowl-shaped valley. The west and the east sides were the lower edges of the valley, while the north and south were the high, steep edges with taller trees and more granite boulders. As always, I brought the loyal canine companion Nina. She is a 4-year-old German Shepherd Pit Bull mix with much tenacity. Without wasting much time, I grabbed some water and a few choice pieces of equipment and headed into the valley. It was just peaceful and sunny. We were making our way through the dense part of the forest towards the juvenile pine trees, which made a sort of clearing. From there, I could see a lot more around me, so I decided to take a moment and sit and collect myself. Nina was off-leash, running around sniffing everything, as she normally does. After about 5 minutes of sitting down, I noticed the birds and bugs were no longer making any noise. It was somewhat subtle because it wasn't terribly noisy to begin with, but I have strong senses. I considered getting Nina back on the leash but decided against it. I watched her for clues and got a red flag. She seemed to be looking around like she knew something was close. Then she picked up the scent of an animal that was recently there and started following it at a fast walking speed. I knew she was on it, so I started to follow her while calling her to see if I could get her back on the leash. I knew that since we didn't hear anything leaving as I crunched my way loudly through the forest, there was a good chance that whatever it was there waiting quietly. Then I think she saw it because she took off after it at full speed up the south side of the valley. The trees were too dense to see what she was after. In my mind, it could have been anything. But I was thinking a deer, maybe a mountain lion. Truthfully, I didn't care what it was. I just wanted to go after my dog. So I ran off in her direction. After a few moments, I would stop and listen. Every time I would stop, I would hear nothing. I knew she had to be far at this point. So instead of chasing after her aimlessly up the mountain at 5,800 feet of elevation, I decided to call out to her and blow my whistle that I keep in my little survival kit. Still, nothing. About 8 minutes or so passed since she had taken off, but I felt like it was a lot longer. She is like a homing pigeon, so I figured she would come running back to me shortly. So I stood quietly waiting for another 2 minutes or so when I heard something large crunching down the mountain in my general direction, fast. I was hoping it was my dog, but the sound of huge branches breaking in a rhythm that resembled a deer extinguished my hopes quickly. I still don't know for sure what it was, but it was moving very fast, and I was hoping my dog would be behind it somewhere, following behind. I pulled out my 10mm loaded with 15 220-grain hard-cast rounds out of my holster, listened, and waited for a moment before I started jogging to not give away my position. The way this thing sounded as it was jumping left, maybe quarter-second gaps of silence, that would give my position away if I was careless. It was running north down the hill, and I was west of its direct path, so I was going to see the profile of it. I waited until it was about 150 feet away. I began running towards this deer noise just before I knew it would be in my field of view. The first thing that caught my eye was something jet black and hairy galloping in perhaps 20-foot leaps. I didn't see any antlers, and its neck was a lot shorter and thicker than a deer's. Its chest was thick, and so was its waist. Its legs were a little bit shorter than a deer's as well. I saw this all in an instant and continued forward, not having any time to think about it. I was still running at about 50% speed with a hand cannon, looking at this thing blazing through the trees at what I would guess to be about 40 miles per hour. I was starting to make a lot of noise, and I was about 100 feet from it. I looked down for a moment to calculate my next few steps. When I looked back up, it was gone. I am certain it had either seen me or heard me. It could have only gone east. There's no other place it could have gone. Probably about 3 minutes later, in the opposite direction, I heard a smaller animal running towards me. The sound was familiar and very welcome. It was Nina. I holstered my weapon and she came up to me, looking happy but wiped out. I was relieved beyond words that she had found me again, and we slowly made our way back. It wasn't until then that I started realizing just how strange that creature truly was. I kept thinking about the details of it, once certain in my mind that it was not a deer. I really was at a loss for an explanation. Then I thought back to the forest going quiet, and how it had only hidden and did not retreat upon my arrival. That is, until its cover was completely blown. Those are predatory behaviors. It really surprised me to see something with jet black fur like that as well. Even black bears would be much lighter in comparison. And even though it had hair or fur, it really looked out of place for some reason. The greasy sheen just didn't seem right. I am not certain that the footprints that I saw 1 year ago are from the same thing that I saw 3 days ago, so I'm going to go back tomorrow. I want to explore the area more and get a better understanding of what is going on. This time, snow will be a factor. The first snow in months is falling heavily right now in that area, but it should be stopping by tomorrow midday. I will likely have my phone on me just in case I see more tracks or anything else worth recording, so I can gather some personal data to help me determine just what I'm dealing with. I'm curious about its intent. I can't let something like that run around if it has bad intentions. Either way, Nina loves the snow, and so do I. If I have another encounter, I will be sure to write back. Stay aware and stay safe out there. Safe out.